When I was 6 months pregnant, my husband brought another woman home and said, "You have 24 hours to pack your things." He changed the locks. I slept in my car, but a lawyer called me. "Ma'am, we have discovered that your husband—" Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always ask me when I knew. When did I really know that the man I married was not the man I thought he was? Honestly? I think some part of me always knew. I just didn't want to listen to it. My name is Claire Matthews, or it was for 7 years. Before that, I was Claire Donovan from Raleigh, North Carolina, a graphic designer with a small studio, a rescue dog named Biscuit, and a stubborn belief that love, if it was real, could hold almost anything together. Marcus came into my life at a gallery opening in 2016. He was confident, well-dressed, and he laughed at exactly the right moments. He worked in real estate development, always moving, always closing deals, always talking about the next thing. I should have noticed, even then, that he talked about the future without ever fully inhabiting the present. We married in 2017, a small ceremony outside of Asheville in a vineyard that smelled of honey and red clay. My mother cried. His mother didn't come. "Family tension," he said, and I didn't push. That should have been signal number 1, but I filed it away somewhere soft and quiet and kept moving forward. For the first 3 years, things were good. Not perfect. Marcus worked long hours, and his ambitions had a way of expanding to fill every room. But good. We bought a house in Cary. We talked about children. We built something that, from the outside, looked sturdy. Then the signals started. Small things at first. He began taking his phone into the bathroom. He bought a second cell phone and told me it was for work. He started coming home past 10 on nights he'd said he'd be back by 7, and his explanations were oddly flat. Traffic, a client dinner, a problem with a contractor, delivered without eye contact. I noticed that he flinched slightly when I reached for his jacket pocket. I noticed that he started locking the car even when it sat in our own driveway. I was 34 years old when I got pregnant. We'd been trying for 2 years, through 2 miscarriages and 1 very dark winter. And when the test came back positive and held, I wept on the bathroom floor for 20 minutes out of sheer relief. Marcus hugged me. He said all the right things. But even then, in that moment, something in his eyes was somewhere else. By my 6th month, the distance had become physical. He slept on the far edge of the mattress, his back to me. He stopped asking how I was feeling. He stopped touching my stomach. The nursery we'd planned together, soft yellow walls, a white crib, a mobile of little paper birds, sat half-finished, and when I asked him about it, he said he'd been busy. I told myself it was stress. I told myself men sometimes pulled back during pregnancy out of fear. I told myself a lot of things. I was sitting on the couch with my feet elevated, reading a book I couldn't concentrate on, when I heard his key in the door. It was a Tuesday evening in October. The light was already gone from the sky. I heard 2 sets of footsteps, and I looked up, and Marcus walked in with a woman I had never seen before. She was tall and slim, in her late 20s, wearing a camel-colored coat. She looked around our living room the way a person looks at a hotel room, assessing it, noting its dimensions. Marcus did not look embarrassed. He did not look sorry. He looked, if anything, irritated that he had to be doing this. "Claire," he said, and his voice was perfectly calm. "This is Vanessa. She's going to be staying here." I waited for the rest of the sentence, the part where he explained, the part where this became something I could understand. There was no rest. "You have 24 hours," he said, "to get your things together and find somewhere to go. I'll have a locksmith here tomorrow afternoon." I remember looking down at my stomach, at the very visible, very undeniable curve of my pregnancy, and then back up at him. "Marcus, I've made my decision," he said. That was all. Vanessa had already set her handbag on the entryway table. My entryway table. She did not speak to me. She did not even look at me directly. She simply moved through the space as though I were already gone. I packed 2 bags. I moved slowly, my hands shaking, my mind a white static. I took my documents, passport, social security card, insurance cards, and some clothes, and my laptop, and the small stuffed rabbit I'd already bought for the baby. I walked out of my own house at 11 o'clock at night, 6 months pregnant, and sat in my car in the driveway for a long time before I started the engine. I had nowhere to go. My mother was 8 hours away. My closest friend, Linda, lived across town. I didn't want to wake anyone. I didn't know how to say the words out loud yet. So I drove to the parking lot of a 24-hour pharmacy 3 miles away, reclined the seat as far as it would go, and I lay there in the dark, listening to the traffic, one hand on my stomach, and I tried to breathe. Have you ever tried to sleep in a car while 6 months pregnant? Your hips ache against the seat. There is no position that is comfortable. The parking lot lights hum and flicker. Every car that pulls in makes you startle awake, heart hammering, hand gripping the door handle before your mind catches up with your body. I slept in 40-minute fragments. Between them, I lay awake doing the kind of accounting that comes only when everything else is stripped away. What did I actually have? I had my car, a 2019 Honda CR-V, still making payments. I had my laptop and a portable hard drive with 3 years of client work. I had about $2,000 in a personal checking account. I had health insurance through Marcus's plan, which, it occurred to me with a cold jolt, he could remove me from. I had a baby coming in 12 weeks. What did I not have? I did not have access to our joint accounts. When I tried to check on my phone, I found that my passwords had already been changed. He had planned this. This was not a sudden emotional decision made in the heat of an argument. He had moved deliberately, carefully, and he had moved first. I sat up in the reclined seat, looking at the fluorescent glow of the pharmacy sign, and I felt something shift inside me. Not resolve, not yet. First came the grief, which hit me in a long, rolling wave. 7 years, the vineyard, the miscarriages we had survived together, the house we had painted ourselves over 2 weekends, Marcus in an old college t-shirt, complaining about the fumes and making me laugh until my sides hurt. All of that. And he had given another woman my entryway table. Then came the fear, clean and specific, for the baby, for my health insurance, for where I would sleep that night, and the night after that. And then, somewhere past 3 a.m, sitting in that parking lot, I thought, no, I am not going to do this quietly. Because here is what Marcus had forgotten, or perhaps had never known, about me. I am a woman who, when she is backed into a corner with nothing left to lose, becomes very, very precise. I needed information before I needed anything else. I needed to know what I was actually dealing with, not just emotionally, but legally, financially. I needed to know what the house was worth, what accounts existed, what my rights were in the state of North Carolina when you are 6 months pregnant and your husband changes the locks. I opened my phone at 4:17 in the morning and began to search. By the time the sun came up gray and cold over the parking lot, I had a list. I had looked up 3 family law attorneys in the Raleigh-Cary area with strong reviews and free consultations. I had read through North Carolina statutes on marital property and equitable distribution. I knew that changing the locks on a marital home and forcing out a spouse, especially a pregnant one, could constitute constructive abandonment and potentially domestic abuse under the law. I drove to a diner on Wake Forest Road, ordered decaf coffee and scrambled eggs, and sat in a corner booth to keep reading. My phone rang at 9:42, a number I didn't recognize. "Ms. Donovan?" said the voice on the other end. A man, measured, professional. "Yes," I said, immediately reverting to my maiden name without thinking. "My name is Daniel Harris. I'm a family law attorney in Cary. I know this may seem unexpected. I was referred to you by your gynecologist, Dr. Elaine Park. She told me you might be in a situation that requires immediate legal attention." I gripped the coffee mug. Dr. Park. My OB, who had been monitoring a high-risk pregnancy, who had my emergency contact listed as my sister in Charlotte, who must have, somehow, been alerted to the fact that something was wrong. I learned later that I had sent a text to Dr. Park's after-hours line sometime around 2 in the morning, apparently without fully realizing it. Something brief and fragmented. "Marcus put me out. I'm in the car. Baby is okay. I don't know what to do." I had no memory of sending it. "Ms. Donovan," Daniel Harris said, "would you be available to come into my office this morning? There are some things I need to discuss with you, things I've uncovered that I believe are directly relevant to your situation." "What things?" I asked. There was a brief pause. Not dramatic, precise. "We've had reason to look into your husband's financial disclosures in connection with a separate matter," he said carefully. "Ma'am, we've found accounts and assets that were not disclosed to you. I think you'll want to see this in person." I set down my coffee cup. For the first time in 14 hours, I felt something other than fear. I felt the beginning of a plan. Daniel Harris's office was on the second floor of a red brick building, just off Kildare Farm Road. The kind of office that is deliberately unintimidating, with neutral walls and a water cooler in the corner, and a receptionist who brought me a cup of herbal tea without being asked. I sat in the consultation room and tried to look steadier than I felt. Daniel was in his mid-50s, with silver hair and the careful, unhurried manner of someone who had spent 30 years watching people in crisis and had learned that the most useful thing he could do was slow everything down. He set a manila folder on the table between us. "Before I explain what's in here," he said, "I want to ask you a few questions about your marriage, specifically about your finances." I told him what I knew. We had a joint checking account and a joint savings account, which I had contributed to consistently from my design work throughout the marriage. We had the house in Cary, purchased in 2019 for $412,000, with a mortgage in both our names. Marcus handled the investments. He had always said he was better with that side of things, and I admitted to Daniel with some difficulty, simply let him. Daniel nodded slowly. "Were you aware," he said, "that your husband has 3 additional accounts that are not in your name, 2 held under a shell LLC he registered in Delaware in 2020, and 1 private brokerage account opened in 2021? The room was very quiet. "No," I said. "Were you aware that he owns a condominium in Wilmington, purchased in 2022, also under the LLC?" I looked at him. "A condominium," I repeated. 2-bedroom unit, ocean view, purchased for $388,000, mortgage-free." He slid a document across the table. A deed. A property I had never heard of. A property purchased with money that had moved through our household, through our shared life, without my knowledge. The Wilmington condo, bought in 2022. The year Marcus had told me that our investment portfolio had taken a significant hit and we needed to be more careful with spending. The year I had stopped buying new clothes. The year I had felt vaguely guilty about ordering takeout. "How did you find this?" I asked. The Shell LLC came up in connection with a dispute involving another party, a contractor Marcus used for a development project. That contractor's attorney subpoenaed financial records, and what came out of that process was considerably more interesting than a construction invoice. Daniel folded his hands. When I cross-referenced those records with public property filings, the condo appeared. The brokerage account required additional investigation, but it was accessible. I sat with this for a moment. 7 years. He had been building a separate financial life, a parallel existence, with money that was, under North Carolina law, marital property. And now he had put a 24-hour clock on my departure, as if I were a guest who had outstayed her welcome. "I want to file for divorce," I said, "and I want every cent of what is legally mine." Daniel nodded. He had, I suspected, been waiting for me to arrive at exactly this sentence. "Then here is what we're going to do," he said. Over the next 2 hours, we mapped out the strategy, an emergency motion for temporary housing rights, which could potentially restore my legal access to the marital home while proceedings were underway, a subpoena for Marcus's full financial records, a formal discovery request targeting the LLC accounts, the brokerage account, and the Wilmington property, a protective order if his behavior escalated. "He will know you've filed the moment the papers are served," Daniel said. "You should be prepared for that." "I know. He may try to move money. Can you stop him?" "We can file an injunction against the dissipation of marital assets. Yes." I exhaled slowly. What I did not know as I left Daniel's office that afternoon and drove to Linda's house, where she met me at the door and pulled me inside without a single question, just a long hug and a bowl of soup, was that I had already been seen. Vanessa, it turned out, had a friend who worked in the same professional building as Daniel Harris. Whether it was coincidence or something more calculated, I cannot say with certainty. But by that evening, Marcus received a text message that simply said, "She went to see a lawyer today." The one on Kildare. I learned this later, in Discovery. I can picture him reading it, jaw tightening, turning to Vanessa and saying nothing. I can picture the first thread of uncertainty entering the picture he'd constructed, the one in which I was simply a problem to be relocated, a complication to be removed. He had underestimated me, badly, and now, just slightly, he was beginning to know it. The divorce papers were served on a Wednesday morning. I know this because Daniel called me at 10:14 a.m. to confirm, and I was sitting in Linda's guest room with my hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea, watching a sparrow on the windowsill, trying to keep my breathing even. "It's done," he said. The process server confirmed delivery at the property at 9:52. I closed my eyes for a moment. Alongside the divorce filing, Daniel had submitted the emergency motion for temporary occupancy rights to the marital home, as well as the asset injunction, a court order preventing Marcus from moving, hiding, or liquidating any marital assets while proceedings were underway. The injunction, by its nature, also froze the LLC accounts and flagged the Wilmington property. Marcus's response came not through an attorney, it came through his phone. He called me 17 times between 11 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon. I did not answer. At 3:06, he sent a text that I saved carefully as evidence. "You have absolutely no idea what you're doing. You think some lawyer is going to help you? I will bury you in this process. You'll spend every penny you have fighting me and end up with nothing. Think about that baby and back off." I read it once. Then I forwarded it to Daniel. At 4 in the afternoon, a black SUV I didn't recognize pulled up in front of Linda's house. Vanessa got out. She came to the front door and knocked, and Linda, bless her, answered with her arms crossed and her expression fully closed. "I need to speak with Claire," Vanessa said. "Claire isn't taking visitors," Linda said. "This is important." "I'm sure it is." There was a pause. Then Vanessa said, more quietly, "She is making a very serious mistake. There are things she doesn't understand about this situation. If she would just talk to me, woman to woman, I can explain." "You can explain through her attorney," Linda said, and shut the door. I heard all of this from the hallway. I stood there, one hand on the wall, the other on my stomach, and I felt the fear, clear and cold, move through me. But beneath it, something else was hardening. Marcus also called my mother. I found out from her that evening when she phoned me, voice shaking. He had told her that I was having an emotional breakdown, that pregnancy hormones had made me irrational, that the story I would tell her was exaggerated. My mother, who had raised 2 daughters on her own after my father left, listened to him for 3 minutes and then said, "My daughter is not irrational. She is precise, and I suggest you speak with her attorney." Then she hung up and called me. That was the moment I started to cry. Not from fear, from the overwhelming physical relief of being believed. The following week was a grinding, bureaucratic campaign, court hearings on the emergency motions, depositions being scheduled, an initial financial disclosure demand sent to Marcus's attorney, who had, belatedly and expensively, been hired within 48 hours of the papers being served. Marcus's attorney, a man named Gerald Frith, was aggressive in the way that attorneys are when they are trying to compensate for a weak position with volume. But the asset injunction held. The LLC accounts were frozen. The Wilmington property was flagged. Daniel told me to take a few days. "You've done the hard part for now," he said. "Let the process run. Rest. You're growing a human being and fighting a war simultaneously. Take the weekend." I did. I stayed in Linda's guest room. I slept. Really slept. For the first time in weeks. I walked around the neighborhood in the mornings, slowly, Biscuit's leash in one hand. Linda had collected my dog from a neighbor who'd been watching him. The pale November sun on my face. I read. I ate properly. I let myself be, for just a few days, something other than a combatant. But I did not stop watching, and I did not stop planning. He came on a Sunday. No warning, no attorney present, no message ahead of time, which, Daniel would later note, was itself a violation of the spirit of the proceedings, though not technically illegal at that stage. Marcus rang Linda's doorbell at 11 in the morning, and when I looked through the peephole and saw him standing there alone in a charcoal coat, looking tired, and, I noted with some detachment, rehearsed in his expression of remorse, I felt absolutely nothing that I had not prepared for. I opened the door. Claire. He exhaled as though the sight of me was a relief. His eyes went to my stomach, and something crossed his face. Guilt, calculation, or some mixture of both that I no longer had any interest in parsing. "Can we talk? Just 5 minutes without lawyers." "We can talk," I said. "Here, with the door open." He blinked. I think he had expected tears, or coldness, or anger, anything that would give him a foothold. What he got was stillness. "I made a terrible mistake," he said. "What I did, the way I handled it, it was wrong. I know that." I waited. Vanessa and it got complicated, but I've been thinking, and what I really want, is to figure out a way that's best for the baby, for both of you. If we could just come to an agreement privately without dragging everything through court. What kind of agreement? I asked. And there it was, the real sentence, the one the preamble had been building toward. Something fair and quiet. You keep the car, a settlement. I'm thinking $200,000, and we handle custody informally. No court, no discovery, no. He paused. No digging into things that don't need to be dug into. No digging into things that don't need to be dug into. The LLC, the Wilmington condo, the brokerage account, $388,000 and more moved through our marriage like water through cupped hands. He was not offering me a settlement. He was offering me silence. I'll have my attorney contact yours, I said, and I closed the door. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to his footsteps retreat down the front path, and I thought, $200,000 for 7 years of marriage, 2 miscarriages, and a baby he ejected from her home at 6 months pregnant. No, not a chance. That same week, Linda took me to a meeting she had been quietly researching, a support group for women going through divorce and custody proceedings, run out of a community center off Hillsborough Street. I went reluctantly. I am, by nature, a private person, and the idea of sharing my situation with strangers felt exposing. But I went. There were 9 women in the room, a folding table, bad coffee, fluorescent lighting, and within 20 minutes I understood why Linda had brought me there. These women had been through versions of what I was experiencing, some milder, some considerably worse. They knew the vocabulary, dissipation of assets, discovery, deposition, forensic accounting. They knew what it felt like to lie awake at 3 a.m. doing the arithmetic of your own vulnerability. They knew, collectively, something that I needed to know, that the system was slow and imperfect and maddening, but that it did, if you stayed in it and kept pressure on, tend to move toward truth. One woman, Renata, mid-40s, a former accountant, leaned forward and said, "You have the financial records. You have the LLC paperwork. You have a good attorney. Don't let him scare you into settling for less than what the court will give you." I drove home with Linda in the dark, watching the city lights blur past the window, and I felt for the first time since that Tuesday evening in October something that I recognized as strength, not borrowed, mine. They came together this time. It was a Thursday evening, 3 weeks before the first major court hearing on asset division. I had, by that point, moved into a short-term furnished apartment. Daniel had secured my temporary occupancy rights to a portion of the marital assets, enough to cover reasonable housing, and I was beginning to feel like a person with an address again, which mattered more than I had anticipated. The apartment was small and impersonal, but it had a second room where I had set up the white crib and the paper bird mobile, and every evening I would stand in that doorway for a moment and remind myself what I was doing this for. The knock at the door came at 7 in the evening. I looked through the peephole and saw both of them, Marcus in a dark jacket, Vanessa slightly behind him in a gray dress, holding what appeared to be a small paper bag, something from a bakery or a specialty food shop, the performance of normalcy, the props of reconciliation. I stood at the door for a full 10 seconds before I moved, just watching them through that small glass circle, noting how carefully they had dressed, how deliberately composed their expressions were. This was not a spontaneous visit. This had been planned, rehearsed, coordinated. That alone told me everything I needed to know about how frightened they had become. I called Daniel. He picked up on the second ring. "They're at my door," I said, "both of them." A beat. "You don't have to answer." "I know," I said, "but I want to hear what they're willing to say." He paused. Keep your phone recording, and remember, nothing you say today is binding. Nothing. Only documents are binding. I opened the door with my phone in my hand, recording app already running. Marcus spoke first, and his tone was different from the Sunday visit. Warmer, more practiced. He had prepared this. Claire, we wanted to come by together because we think there's been a lot of misunderstanding and... We have nothing against you, Vanessa said, stepping forward with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Whatever Marcus and I have, that's between us. But you are going to be the mother of his child, and we want a relationship with that child. We want things to be peaceful. That's very thoughtful, I said. Marcus exhaled. What we're proposing is simple. You drop the discovery requests, specifically the ones targeting the business accounts. We agree to a fair split of the residential property, and we work out a parenting plan together without the court being involved in every detail. He leaned slightly forward. Claire, the things that attorney is digging into. If this goes to full discovery, it gets ugly for everyone. For the baby's future. For your reputation, for your accounts, I said. Something flickered in his face. He recovered quickly. I'm trying to protect all of us. Vanessa reached out and touched my arm. I looked at her hand. She removed it. You seem like a reasonable woman, she said, and there was a new edge under the warmth now, thin and sharp. Surely you understand that fighting this in court, at this stage of your pregnancy, puts you at risk. The stress alone, your doctor would tell you. My doctor, I said, is the one who got me an attorney. A silence. Marcus's composure, which had been carefully assembled, showed its first crack. His jaw tightened. Then Vanessa tried a different angle entirely, shifting her weight, softening her voice to something that almost resembled genuine concern. Claire, I know you think I'm the villain here. I understand that. But Marcus loves this child. Whatever happened between the two of you, that baby deserves two parents who are not at war. She placed one hand briefly over her heart. I am asking you, one woman to another, to think about what a courtroom does to a family, to a child, to you. It was, I had to admit, a more sophisticated appeal than I had expected from her. She was good at this. She had clearly spent time with the argument, testing its edges, finding the version that sounded most like compassion and least like threat. Under other circumstances, if I had been less informed, less supported, less certain of what was in those financial records, it might have landed. I'll have Daniel contact Gerald Frith in the morning, I said. Good night. I closed the door. I stood on the other side of it for a full minute. My hands were shaking, not from weakness, from the sheer physiological effort of holding everything in check while they stood there and tried to dismantle me with paper bags and soft voices and veiled warnings about my health. Was I afraid? Yes, absolutely. The fear was real and specific. They had resources and they had the motivation to make this difficult. Marcus was not a man who conceded easily. Vanessa, I was beginning to understand, was not simply a passive participant. She was strategic and she was invested. But fear, I had learned over the past weeks, was not the opposite of courage. It was the fuel. I sat down on the couch, one hand on my stomach, feeling the baby shift and settle, and I thought about what Renata had said. You have the records. You have a good attorney. Stay in it. I picked up my phone and emailed Daniel the audio file. Then I made a cup of tea and I went to bed, and for the first time in a long time, I slept without waking. The hearing was on a Tuesday in January. The kind of gray winter morning in North Carolina that feels suspended. No weather quite decided. Sky the color of unpolished silver. I wore a dark blue dress and flat boots, and I sat in the hallway outside courtroom 4B with Daniel for 20 minutes before we were called in, and I didn't speak much. There was nothing left to work through. Everything had already been thought. Daniel had prepared me over 3 separate meetings in the preceding 2 weeks. He had walked me through every document, every transfer record, every LLC filing, until the numbers and dates were as familiar to me as my own phone number. He had told me, "Sit still, sit straight. Do not react visibly to anything said at the opposing table. Do not look at Marcus with anything readable on your face." I had practiced this. In the car on the way to the courthouse, I had sat with my hands folded in my lap and let the silence settle around me like something deliberate. Judge Patricia Holden presided. 60 years old, angular, with reading glasses she wore halfway down her nose, and a manner that communicated, without ambiguity, that she had heard every version of every story and had very little patience for performance. I liked her immediately. Marcus sat at the opposing table with Gerald Frith. Vanessa was not present in the courtroom. She had no legal standing in the divorce proceedings, but I had seen her in the hallway when we arrived, sitting with her arms crossed in a row of chairs near the elevator. She caught my eye. I looked away first, but not out of fear, out of indifference, which is a different thing entirely. Daniel presented the financial evidence methodically and without drama, the joint accounts, my contributions to the marital estate, 7 years of deposited design income, documented, the mortgage in both names, and then the other things, the Delaware LLC, the brokerage account, the Wilmington condominium purchased in 2022, forensic accounting reports, bank transfer records showing the movement of funds from joint accounts into the LLC's holdings over a period of 4 years. 4 years. He'd been doing this for 4 years. Judge Holden examined the documents over her reading glasses. She asked Gerald Frith to respond. Frith's strategy had been, up until this point, to argue that the LLC was a legitimate business entity, that its assets were not marital property, and that the brokerage account had been funded exclusively by premarital income. He had prepared documentation in support of this. What he had not prepared for was the forensic accountant Daniel had hired, a woman named Dr. Lena Carroll, who had spent 22 years doing exactly this kind of work and who took the stand with the quiet authority of someone who has never once been wrong about a number. Dr. Carroll walked the court through the transfers, 47 individual transactions over 4 years, moving funds from the joint checking account, funds that included my income, into the LLC's operating account, from which the Wilmington property had eventually been purchased. She showed the dates, she showed the amounts, she showed the timeline. Her delivery was entirely without flourish, no raised voice, no dramatic pauses, just a precise sequential account of what the records showed, presented as though the numbers themselves were speaking through her, which, in a sense, they were. And then Gerald Frith made the mistake of trying to cross-examine her. He suggested that the transfers could represent legitimate business expenses, payments to contractors, operational costs. Dr. Carroll produced itemized records showing that the LLC had, during the period in question, engaged in only 3 actual transactions with outside parties, none of which accounted for more than 12% of the transferred funds. The rest had been absorbed into what amounted to a private holding. Frith shifted to arguing that Marcus's premarital business interests had seeded the LLC, and therefore its assets were separate property. Marcus had a premarital business interest. He had registered a sole proprietorship in 2013, 3 years before we met, that had earned a total of $64,000 before effectively going dormant. Daniel let Frith finish. Then he placed a document on the table. The LLC had been registered in 2020. The opening capital deposit had come from the joint account. Judge Holden looked at the document. She looked at Gerald Frith. She looked at Marcus. I watched Marcus from across the room. I had been watching him since we sat down, not with anger. I was past anger by then, but with the particular attention of someone studying something they once thought they knew. He had been composed at the start of the hearing. Now, as the documents accumulated and Frith's arguments visibly lost traction, I watched the composure begin to separate from him like paint from a wall in damp weather. His right hand, which had been resting flat on the table, curled slowly into a loose fist and then released. Curled and released. He didn't seem to notice he was doing it. I noticed. He leaned over and said something in Frith's ear. Frith shook his head slightly. Marcus said something else. Frith kept his eyes on his papers and did not respond. Whatever private strategy they had rehearsed together in preparation for this day, it was not surviving contact with Dr. Carroll's spreadsheets. Judge Holden set down her pen. "Mr. Frith," she said, "I am going to ask your client to respond directly to one question before we recess." She looked at Marcus. "Mr. Matthews, were you aware, at the time you transferred funds from your joint marital account into the Delmarva Properties LLC account, that those funds included income earned by your wife?" Marcus looked at Frith. Frith looked at the table. Marcus began. "The accounts were... It's complicated, Your Honor, because of the way the... Yes or no, Mr. Matthews?" Silence. The silence lasted long enough to be its own answer. "We'll recess," Judge Holden said, and she stood, and that was the moment. Not the final ruling, not the paperwork, not even the numbers. That was the moment I knew it was over. I kept my face very still. I kept my hands flat on the table. But inside, something that had been wound tight for months released itself, slowly, like a fist opening. The ruling came 4 weeks later, and it was, in the language of legal documents, comprehensive. Judge Holden found that the Delmarva Properties LLC had been funded in substantial part by marital assets, and therefore its holdings, including the Wilmington condominium, constituted marital property subject to equitable distribution. The brokerage account was similarly classified, given Dr. Carroll's documentation of its funding sources. The marital estate, once properly valued, came to just under $1.4 million. The Carey house, the Wilmington property, the joint accounts, the LLC assets, and the brokerage account, minus debts. Under North Carolina's equitable distribution statute, and given the specific circumstances, Marcus's concealment of assets, his unilateral removal of me from the marital home while pregnant, his documented attempts to pressure me into a private settlement that would have bypassed discovery, the court awarded me 58%. I kept the house. Marcus was ordered to refinance the mortgage into his own name within 90 days and pay me the equivalent of my equity share in cash, which, after appraisal, came to just over $400,000. I received a structured settlement on the LLC and brokerage assets. I received full physical custody of our daughter, with Marcus granted supervised visitation that would transition to standard visitation upon completion of a parenting evaluation, something Judge Holden had ordered on her own initiative, based on his conduct during the pregnancy period. He was also ordered to maintain my health insurance through the end of the pregnancy and pay a portion of medical costs, and he was ordered to pay Daniel's legal fees, a provision that Daniel had argued for and that the court granted based on Marcus's concealment of assets, which the ruling characterized as deliberate and sustained. I read the ruling twice, slowly, at Daniel's desk. He sat across from me and let me read without interruption, which I appreciated. The second time through, I was looking not for the numbers, I had already absorbed those, but for the language, the specific measured language of the court's findings, deliberate and sustained. Those two words, so clean and so final, described 4 years of careful deception, 4 years of transfers, of shell filings, of a condo I had never seen, of a life being constructed in parallel to mine, behind my back, with my money, and they had been reduced, in Judge Holden's ruling, to 7 syllables. There is something almost satisfying about that, about watching the elaborate architecture of a lie compressed into plain judicial language. Gerald Frith filed an objection to the asset classification. It was denied. Frith filed a motion to reconsider the fee award. It was denied. Marcus, I was told by Daniel, was furious. He called the ruling biased. He called the forensic accountant's methodology flawed. He called me vindictive. He told at least 2 mutual acquaintances, people we had known together during the marriage, that the court had been manipulated. Those acquaintances, to their credit, called me afterward to let me know. I thanked them and changed the subject. What he did not do was appeal, because the grounds for appeal were non-existent. The record was clear. The transfers were documented. The timeline was documented. Dr. Carroll's analysis was airtight. He had built a very careful structure, and the structure had been mapped, measured, and disassembled on the public record. I signed the final papers on a Thursday afternoon in Daniel's office, in the same room where I had sat 7 weeks earlier with a cup of herbal tea, shaking. The light was different that afternoon. A thin winter sun coming through the blinds at a low angle, laying stripes of gold across the conference table. I remember noticing it. I remember thinking that the room looked the same, and I did not. Daniel handed me the last page. I signed it. He signed as witness. His receptionist, who brought me herbal tea on that first morning, who had greeted me at every subsequent appointment with a quiet, steady warmth, brought in 2 small paper cups of sparkling water from a bottle she kept in the break room for such occasions. "How do you feel?" Daniel asked. I thought about it honestly. "Like I slept in a parking lot for one night," I said, "and it was worth it." He laughed, a real one, surprised. "I'll remember that." I drove home to Linda's house, where I was still staying while the mortgage transfer was processed and the house was officially returned to my sole occupancy. Linda had made dinner. We sat at the kitchen table and ate pasta and talked about small things. A book she was reading, a neighborhood dog that kept escaping its yard. And at some point I realized that I was simply happy. Not triumphant, not vindicated, just quiet and steady and warm in a kitchen that smelled of garlic and bread, with a baby moving in my stomach and a friend across the table. That was enough. In that moment, it was more than enough. There was one more thing. In the course of the asset discovery, it emerged that the Wilmington condominium had been purchased, at least in part, as a residence for Vanessa. She had been staying there periodically for over a year. The condo was now ordered sold and the proceeds divided. She had no legal claim to the property. She was not a party to the proceedings. She had no ownership stake. And she was formally notified that she would need to vacate. She sent me a text. 2 words. "You're cruel." I read it once. I did not respond. Some sentences don't deserve one. My daughter was born on the 14th of February, which was, as Linda said, almost annoyingly symbolic, but which I chose to receive as a gift rather than a cliché. Her name is Eleanor Rose. She came into the world at 6:47 in the morning, 7 pounds and 3 ounces, with an extraordinary amount of dark hair and a completely unambiguous opinion about being cold. She screamed. She was perfect. I lay in the hospital bed with her on my chest and felt with an almost physical certainty that the architecture of my life had reorganized itself around something real and permanent. The nurses moved quietly around the room, and the morning light came through the blinds in soft horizontal lines, and I thought, everything that happened led here. Every night in that parking lot, every court document, every closed door, all of it had led to this specific weight in my arms, this specific smell, this specific sound of a person who had not yet learned to be afraid of anything. My mother flew in from Raleigh. She'd come up to stay with me in the final weeks, sleeping in the second bedroom of the apartment, making coffee at 5 in the morning and letting Biscuit out into the small courtyard. She was in the delivery room when Eleanor arrived. I have a photograph of that moment. My mother holding Eleanor an hour after birth, tears streaming down her face, completely unself-conscious about it, that I keep on the desk in what is now my home office. The house closed back into my name in late March. I hired a contractor and finished the nursery. I painted over the yellow walls, not because I didn't like yellow, but because I wanted something new, something chosen without history, a soft sage green with white trim. I hung the mobile of paper birds. I put the small stuffed rabbit in the corner of the crib. I stood in the doorway on a Saturday afternoon with Eleanor on my hip, Biscuit sleeping in a rectangle of sun on the hallway floor, and I thought, this is mine. I rebuilt my design studio. The clients I had kept through the disruption became the core of a practice that, within 18 months, was larger than it had ever been. I hired a part-time assistant. I bought new equipment. I redesigned my entire workspace. A dedicated room at the back of the house with good northern light and bookshelves I had always wanted but somehow never allowed myself to put up. I designed my own hours around Eleanor's schedule, and I found that work done in concentrated, intentional blocks was often better than the diffuse, anxiety-ridden hours I had put in during the later years of the marriage, when I was unconsciously compensating for a sadness I couldn't name. My income in the second year after the divorce was 30% higher than in any year of the marriage. I did not find that surprising. I found it clarifying. I am not, I will tell you honestly, a person who enjoys bitterness. It is an expensive emotion. It costs more than it returns. So I will not linger on what happened to Marcus and Vanessa out of any satisfaction in their suffering. I will simply tell you the facts because they are relevant and because pretending they didn't happen would be its own kind of untruth. Marcus was forced to liquidate the Wilmington property in a market that had cooled since its purchase. He lost money on the sale, roughly $40,000 after costs and the court-ordered division. The Delaware LLC, with its assets distributed and its operations scrutinized during discovery, was effectively dismantled. He returned to real estate work as a salaried broker, which he had been before he began building his parallel empire, at a substantially reduced income. The supervised visitation order remained in place for 14 months before transitioning. He completed the parenting evaluation without incident, but the process was, by all accounts, humbling. He was also required to attend a financial accountability course as a condition attached to the custody transition. a small detail in the court's final order that Daniel told me was unusual, a reflection of Judge Holden's particular view of the case. I thought about that sometimes, about Marcus sitting in a community room somewhere, being walked through the concept of financial transparency by a court-appointed counselor. I did not feel pleasure at the image. I felt something closer to the quiet satisfaction of a system working as it was supposed to. Vanessa left North Carolina within 3 months of the condo sale. She moved to Atlanta, according to Linda's sources, which are formidable. And she and Marcus, who had rebuilt their relationship on the rubble of mine, did not survive the weight of what they had done together. The last I heard, they were no longer in contact. I heard this without pleasure and without grief. They were simply two people who had made choices, and the choices had consequences, and that is how the world actually works, most of the time, if you give it enough room. There is someone in my life now, a man named James, a high school biology teacher who coaches cross-country and makes very good risotto and is entirely unbothered by Eleanor, who has, at 16 months, the temperament of a small, benevolent dictator. He came into my life slowly and without drama, which is exactly how I needed it to come. We've been careful with each other. We have been honest. Those two things, I have learned, are not as common a combination as they ought to be. I live in my house. I work from my house. Eleanor sleeps in the sage-green nursery under the mobile of paper birds. Biscuit, who is now 12 years old and moves more slowly than he used to, still claims the rectangle of hallway sun every morning. I am not the person who slept in a parking lot at 3 a.m, terrified and alone. But I am not entirely separate from her either. She is the one who decided, in the cold dark of a 24-hour pharmacy parking lot, that she was not going to do this quietly. I owe her everything. I was 6 months pregnant and sleeping in my car. A year later, I owned my home, my income, and my future. What would you have done, sitting in that parking lot at 3 a.m? I'd love to know. Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Thank you for listening.